All right. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening. I don't know where people are everywhere watching us now and ready for this talk. On behalf of Abralin, I would like to welcome Professor Gillian Sankoff and thank her very much for accepting our invitation to participate in the series of lives the Brazilian Association of Linguistics has been promoting. Professor Gillian Sankoff is Professor Emerita of Linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and her contribution to the development of the variationist approach to sociolinguistics is recognized and respected worldwide. She earned her PhD in 1968 from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, with a dissertation, Social Aspects of Multilingualism in New Guinea. Her work on Pidgin and Creoles, on acquisition and language contact, on analysis of many aspects of Montreal French, and in more recent years, on language change over the course of the speaker's lifespan are very well known. I would like also to tell the audience, particularly those from younger generations who are following this meeting, that Brazilian sociolinguists have a special connection with Gillian. She was the supervisor of Fernando Tarallo's PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. So we treasure this bond of friendship and have an additional reason to be indebted to Gillian ever. So the title of Gillian's talk is Linguistic Change, Speaker Trajectories and Language History. Please, Gillian, we are ready to listen to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. I am very humbled by your wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for it. Thank you very much to Abralin for inviting me, and to Miguel Oliveira, the president, who has done so much over this past COVID-19 situation to encourage linguists all around the world. So, I have to share my screen. So here we go. I hope you can see my PowerPoint now. Can you see it? No. Okay. PowerPoint.
Not yet.
Not yet. Share. Okay. Okay now. Can we see it now?
Yes, it's working now.
Okay, so I treasure that introduction because I have a little surprise for you. I didn't tell anybody about this, but I had prepared it already last week. And it's because I have a dedication to a very important linguist whose name was just mentioned. And now I can't seem to get there we go. So I would like to say that this talk is dedicada à memória do professor Fernando Tarallo, extraordinário linguista brasileiro que perdemos cedo demais. We lost him much too soon and treasure his memory. So to get started, this is the plan of the talk today. And I think my timing is going to be okay, so I better just get started. Starting with the beginnings in the 1960s, Maria Eugenia told everybody that I got my PhD in 1968, correct? So in the 1960s was, the beginning of sociolinguistics, the beginning of the modern quantitative sociolinguistics. So this coincided with the beginning of my academic career. So as a graduate student, the first paper I read by Bill Labov was the one published in the American Anthropologist in 1964, Phonological Correlates of Social Stratification. This was based on his study of New York City. With a brand new PhD in 1968, I was hired at the Université de Montréal in Montreal as a professeur adjoint, which is like the assistant professor. And soon, along with David Sankoff and Henrietta Cedergren, I began to think about how to design a study that would illuminate the relationship between language and society in the French of Montreal. Henrietta Cedergren's Cornell University dissertation was the first to use quantitative sociolinguistic methodology on a Romance language. She was studying the Spanish of Panama City. And David's mathematical expertise was essential in all the phases of our research, from sample design to quantitative analysis. I organized a seminar over an entire academic year with an eager group of students. We discussed the social stratification of English in New York City chapter by chapter, and by the spring of 1971, we had secured funding to begin our study. Now, on the next slide, this is not what we looked like in 1971. This photo was actually taken at an NWAVE meeting in Ottawa in 2007, when we three organizers of the research participated in a panel, along with Suzanne Leberge there on the left, who was a graduate student of mine at the Université de Montréal, and she had been instrumental in the 1971 research in many ways. There also is Pierrette Thibault right next to her, who was another former graduate student, by then a professor at the Université de Montréal. And I should say, Suzanne, I hope you are able to hear us today. She is currently a full professor at the University of Montreal herself. So I'll take up the narrative of our project shortly, but first I want to introduce a few general considerations. In the years since the 1960s, the quantitative study of language variation and change has flourished, as Bill Leboeuf discussed in his lecture last week. And as we've explained to students in every introductory lecture, ongoing change implies variation that is conditioned by a multitude of social factors. Change itself can be discerned by identifying its traces across the age of speakers in the community. Since people's phonology and grammar is largely set by the time they reach adulthood, the principle of apparent time can be used in the present to give us a window on the past. Much like stratigraphy in geology, the language of people in the present who are now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s can be used to represent the stage of the language when they acquired it 5, 6, or 7 decades earlier. Now, we sociolinguists have learned a lot about the processes of ongoing change in language. But there's, of course, another branch of linguistics that specializes in the study of language change, and that's historical linguistics. I was introduced to historical linguistics in the first class I took in linguistics as an undergraduate at McGill University. When I took this class, there was no linguistics department, and it was certainly not possible to major in linguistics. Only one course was offered, and that was given by a linguist in the classics department, Douglas Ellis, who had also done field research on Cree and has since contributed a great deal to Algonquian linguistics. I'm happy to hear that Professor Ellis is alive and well in Canada at the age of 97, and that he published the 3rd volume of his series, Spoken Cree, in 2017, I believe, 2016 or 2017. We used in his class the 1958 textbook of Charles Hockett, which was called A Course in Modern Linguistics. Now, although most of this book is devoted to synchronic linguistics, from a structuralist perspective, the final chapters concern diachronic linguistics, about which Hockett wrote, diachronic linguistics has 2 aspects. The process of development of speech habits in a single person from birth to death is linguistic ontogeny, the study of which is one aspect of diachronic linguistics. I will not call it linguistic ontogeny in this talk. I'll talk about language across the lifespan. In fact, Hockett only devoted 9 pages to this aspect of diachronic linguistics, but he said some very important things about it. The rest of his book is devoted to what he called phylogeny, and he says the histories of language as wholes through successive decades and centuries is linguistic phylogeny. For the study of the latter, the term that historical linguistics is customary, and that's what, of course, I will call it. So historical linguistics, he devotes the whole rest of his book, almost 200 pages, to that topic. But how do ontogeny and phylogeny, lifespan change in the speaker, and change in the languages fit together. In fact, in his book, we don't read a word about it. At the end of the chapter on ontogeny, Hackett speculates that the blood and bone of many languages is transmitted largely through successive generations of 4 to 10-year-olds. The fires of childhood competition and the twists of childhood prestige do more to shape a given individual's speech patterns for life than does any contact with adults. He goes on to talk about what we now call the critical period or the sensitive period. He says, if a child has not yet reached the verge of adolescence and is transplanted to an environment in which a different language is spoken, he usually accommodates to the language eventually with high accuracy. And yet, 10 to 15 years later, he discusses what we now know about dialect contact. An individual goes through a comparable narrowing down in adaptability to new local varieties of his own language. An American between the ages of about 19 and 25, if taken to a new part of the US or Canada, will adjust to the different dialect of English in a few months, and earlier habits may become completely submerged. Past those ages, the adjustment is slower and usually never complete. Now, those remarks of Hackett were amazingly prescient at a time when little research had been done on dialect contact. Since that time, Peter Trudgill's 1986 book, Dialects in Contact, and Jack Chambers' seminal paper in 1992 on Canadian children moving to England has been followed up by a great deal of sociolinguistic research on dialect contact. Tagliamonte and Mulfenter's study of very young Canadian children moving to England enriched Chambers' study with great attention to phonological detail, and David Britton and Paul Kurzweil undertook large-scale studies in the UK. Among many others, dialect contact in the US was studied by Arvilla Payne, by Daniel Johnson, by Jennifer Nitsch, while Ricardo Otegui and Ana Celia Centella studied contact in the US among Spanish speakers of diverse national origins. In Brazil, rural speakers moving to urban areas have been studied by Stella Bottoni Ricardo and also by my own student, Clarissa Sorek Clark, who I also have to thank for a little bit of help with the formulation of the dedication on the beginning of the talk. I'm sure there's a great deal more research that I have not kept up with since my retirement. Now, these studies of dialect contact in examining speakers of different ages have revealed what is likely in terms of language shift for speakers of different ages, and thus contribute importantly to an understanding of what is possible in speakers' trajectories of change at different points in their lifespan. However, very few linguists, to my knowledge, have attempted to understand how lifespan change relates to language change. So in my lecture today, I'll review some of the literature I'm aware of, as well as the work of myself and colleagues on Montreal French, and then contribute some ideas that may hopefully inspire future research on this question. Now, the Montreal French study, I just didn't quite want to show you that slide yet. Since my retirement from teaching at Penn in 2012, I've had the opportunity to complete work that was started a long time ago. Much of that work has had to do with language change across the lifespan, based on evidence available in 3 corpora of the French of Montreal, recorded in the 1970s, the 80s, and 90s. Today, I'll briefly outline what I've called the 3 trajectory types that speakers appear to follow in adolescence, adulthood, and old age, as they react to language change ongoing in communities that they're a part of, and to situate those trajectories within the larger scope of language history. As I mentioned earlier, the project that was designed by David Sankoff, Henrietta, and myself was designed as a study that would be patterned after the New York City study. But our goal was not purely descriptive. A further goal related to the theme of social justice, as discussed in LeBeau's lecture last week. In a 1976 article, we wrote that our goal was to identify the nature, extent, and function of linguistic diversity within the French spoken by Montrealers in order to clarify the situation of a population suffering from extreme linguistic alienation. In the early 1970s, not only did the French in Quebec suffer from the pressure of the Canadian English majority, but the variety of French spoken in Quebec was much disparaged and subject to official campaigns that considered it to be illegitimate in the sense of Bourdieu's language about legitimate language. And the Canadian Prime Minister of the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who's the father of the current Prime Minister, had to walk back an interview in which he had characterized the French of Quebec as, quote, lousy French, unquote. Now, the National Radio and TV Network had sponsored a panel deploring the local French, which inspired a demonstration outside the station by linguists, including ourselves. This is a picture of Pierrette Thibault and Henrietta Cedergren picketing that radio station on the issue of its lack of respect for the local variety of French. So a good deal of our own research was to demystify the idea that Quebec French was not a legitimate language. Beginning in May 1971, interviews were recorded with 120 Montrealers in a stratified random sample of residential addresses in all census tracts of the city that numbered at least 60% native French speakers. There you see a map of the city. On the left, the colored one is a road map, I believe, and the bottom one, the one on the bottom right, is the map as we decorated it in terms of our sampling universe. So and the parts that are not numbered are the parts where there is not a majority of 65% or more of francophones in the city. We established 6 levels of social stratification according to mean family income level, with 20 respondents selected in each. So we spend, there is the light blue in the back is how many people are in those slices. But we took 20% out of each of them to make sure that we had enough diversity at both ends of the social scale to adequately represent other social dimensions. In addition to income level, the sampling grid contained equal numbers of male and female speakers and 4 age groups. We deliberately oversampled adolescents in the hope that ongoing linguistic changes might be concentrated in this population. This turned out to be a boon for Pierrette Thibault and Gillian Sankoff, who designed the restudy in 1984, since it was a lot easier to relocate those younger speakers and also more fruitful in identifying ongoing change, and in fact, to contribute to the panel studies that we've done since. Fully 60 of the original participants were re-interviewed in 1984, along with 12 younger speakers interviewed for the first time. Diane Vincent and her colleagues re-interviewed a smaller subset again in 1995. A precious 12 speakers were interviewed at all 3 periods. Now, as announced in the title, this is just a picture of a street scene in a very typical level in a lower middle class neighborhood of the city. Photo that was taken about a decade later than our study, but the street looks very much like it did then, even today. As announced in the title, the overall goal of my lecture today is to explore the relationship between the language history of individual speakers and language history writ large. In an article that appeared in Language last year, I propose that there are 3 possible patterns that can occur across speakers' lifespans with respect to ongoing language changes. And I illustrated each trajectory type with one particular change. So I'll briefly summarize those here. In each of the 3 cases, I'm going to make 2 comparisons. First, in order to ascertain that a particular change is going on, the speech community has to be sampled in the same way at 2 different times, and the speech of the speakers in each sample compared. This is called a trend comparison, and is carried out by selecting a different set of speakers from our corpus for each sample period, matched by age, sex, and social class, creating what Hélène Blondeau has referred to as social twins across the 2 periods, and comparing the relevant linguistic feature in the earlier and later groups. If the 2 speaker samples faithfully represent the speech community, the comparison can reveal whether the feature is stable or changing, and if the latter, in what direction. Now, having used this procedure to establish change in the speech community, which was indeed ongoing in each of the 3 cases that I will present, we looked to discover whether individual speakers were changing. To do this, we constructed a panel sample, speakers for whom recordings were available from 2 study periods. Remember, there are 60 such people, and compared their use of the feature in question at both times. The first trajectory then is speaker stability. Using the present to explain the past, relying on older speakers to faithfully represent the state of the language when they learned it is only possible if these older speakers have not changed or not changed much. Leboeuf's 2007 paper, Transmission and Diffusion, suggests the age of 18 for the point at which young people stop incrementing a phonological change in progress. And the weight of dialect contact evidence tends to support this as a reasonable estimate, and incidentally, matching Hockett's proposal fairly well. This would mean that after the end of adolescence, most speakers will be fairly stable. Now, speaker stability was found to be the case with auxiliary selection in our longitudinal study. This was a change in progress as assessed by comparing the speaker samples matched for age, sex, and social class for the 2 study periods. Now, the variable in question was the non-standard use of avoir with a small set of verbs of motion, state, and change of state. And the trend comparison showed that this was changing in that être, the standard form, was beginning to take over from non-standard avoir. Auxiliary selection was variable, however, for almost every speaker. You see the example. The person says, Rita says, j'ai venu au monde. Now, venir is not a very likely verb to take avoir, and speakers were more likely, for example, to use avoir with a verb like arriver, to arrive, than with the, speakers were less likely to use avoir with a verb like venir, to come, or arriver, to arrive, than with a verb like retourner, or tomber, to fall. However, for the panel of 60 speakers recorded in both years, their frequency of non-standard avoir use in 1984 remained stable. That is, when you interviewed the same people, they did not change. The community was changing towards more être, but the speakers were not. And how is this showing up? Oh, I know why this is showing up. Because Pierrette Thibault and I wrote about auxiliary selection in 1977. Our first paper was on this topic, was from that date. And that's the name of the papers, the references to the papers. Later on, Suzanne Wagner joined our team during a time when Pierrette was on sabbatical in the University of Pennsylvania. And the 3 of us wrote a paper that we presented at NWAVE on the diachrony of this process. That paper was not published, but recently the data has been included in other publications. Now, this slide shows the percentage of use of avoir for 4 speaker groups defined in terms of each speaker's own usage pattern. The group D speakers on the left included only those who used avoir with the most unlikely verbs, like with venir that we saw before. Overall, they used avoir at a rate of 54% in 1971. Now, those same speakers registered 46% in 1984, but this apparent drop was not statistically significant. This group consisted mainly of older speakers, those at the bottom of the social ladder with little formal education. Group A speakers, those who rarely used avoir and only with the most likely verbs like tomber, to fall, tended to be highly educated members from professional and upper class families. The graph for them shows an apparent small increase, which was again not statistically significant. The 2 middle groups show complete stability. Now, variability in morphosyntax provides fewer tokens to work with, but the aggregated members provided reliable patterns. The verb venir, to come or become, was used at a rate of only 7.3%, but there were a large number of tokens, 618 for the group as a whole. And that was only found in the speech of the least educated older speakers. One example from Group D is, again, Rita, who was 41 in 1971. And she answered the question, where were you born? By saying, okay, those things are what I just said. Well, I think I had Rita on the screen before. Yes, j'ai venu au monde à Villemar. She was born in Villemar. Okay, when she was interviewed again at age 54 in 1984, she used venir also with avoir. Summarizing this case, we can say that auxiliary selection appears to be an early acquired pattern that speakers retain stably as they age. All right, I'll flip through now to the next trajectory type, which is speakers adopting an ongoing change later in life. A case where we found many speakers adopting an ongoing language change later in life is the replacement of an alveolar tongue tip R with a dorsal, velar or uvular R in Montreal French. Hélène Blondeau, whose photo is up there on the upper left, worked together with me on the change in R pronunciation when she was a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania. And our joint research, along with Anne Charity Hudley, who was a graduate student at the time, was published in a series of articles between 2003 and 2007. The most complete report appeared as a paper in Language in 2007. Today, I'm going to summarize the major findings and their implications for the relationship between lifespan change and language change in linguistic history. Although, as in the previous case, we used a trend comparison to verify that language change was occurring, the change from an alveolar to a uvular pronunciation of R in Montreal French was already well documented on the basis of earlier research. In the 1950 publication, Vinet had already documented that beginning and showed that Montreal was beginning to show the posterior R, the velar or uvular R, typical of Eastern Quebec and Standard French. 20 years later, we could hear it all around us. And I must say, in my own experience as a second language speaker of French, I remember as a teenager being drilled, this was in the mid-50s, by a girlfriend of mine, Micheline, who was teaching me how to do alveolar R. And she used the word carreau, meaning square. And I had to say carreau, 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 etc. many, many, many times. That was the norm at the time. 20 years later, I myself found that I had switched without even thinking about it to the incoming R. Now, so although, yeah, we heard this, by the 1970s, early 1970s, you could hear a lot of posterior R. And our trend comparison confirmed that massive change was indeed ongoing. This comparison paired a sample of 32 speakers from 1984 with 32 different individuals from 1971, again matched for age, sex, and social class. We divided each temporal sample into two age groups, the younger ones aged 15 to 24 and older ones 25 to 61. Calculating the percentage of posterior R for older speakers, we found that the rate of 34% in 1971 had more than doubled to 75% for the older speakers. For the analogous group in 1984, the rate had doubled. The younger speakers registered a mean of 68% in 1971, as compared with a rate of 92% for their social twins in 1984. These increases confirmed the fact that the change was proceeding rapidly in the community. Now, in order to assess the individual speaker trajectories, we selected a panel sample from the set of 60 speakers that was recorded both in 71 and 84. In parallel with the trend samples, the panel sample was composed of 16 younger speakers and 16 older speakers. Calculating again the percentage of uvular R over all the tokens, the younger panel speakers as a group registered an increase of 22 percentage points over the 13-year period. As they grew into young and middle adulthood, you will see that their 1971 rates are indicated with blue dots and the blue diamonds it is, and the 1984 results by pink squares. For the older speakers as a group, the increase was about the same number of percentage points, 23%. Now, the group results are instructive, indicating first that phonological change was in progress, and secondly, that there were speakers past the age of 15. 15 was the youngest speakers we had in our sample, who altered their phonology in the direction of the innovation being pioneered by speakers younger than themselves. Fortunately, in this case, however, token numbers were high enough to allow an examination of individual speakers and individual differences. We noted that in the paper that Hélène Blondeau and I wrote together in 2007, we noted that the group means give a misleading picture of the sample members as a homogeneous group. This increase is far from uniform when we look at individuals. All of the panel speakers on this slide this slide represents all the panel speakers and indicates that the teenage speakers were the ones most likely to change. followed by those between age 20 and 30 in 1971. Indeed, of those 20 to 30-year-olds whose speech production was variable in 1971, the ones that you see in the middle of the chart, all of them had become categorical users of the dorsal variant by 1984. Some of the children in their mid-teens in 1971 were recorded in the family kitchen with parents who always used the apical variant as typical Montrealers of their generation. Our conclusion was that for this first generation of teenagers for whom the dorsal variant is the norm, this was not the first form they acquired in their families. These teenagers seem to have made the switch due to later influence from peers. Thus, we argued that the behavior of the 20-somethings who made the transition between 1971 and 1984, all those guys in the middle who get to be at the top in pink, we figured that it was best not to characterize them as doing anything but catching up with their peers. They were, the early adopters were already up there at 100%, and the other ones caught up with them later. Now, with so many speakers having shifted in the direction of community change, how would an apparent time inference based on their 1984 distribution have fared compared with the historical events? Clearly, basing an inference on apparent time would have led to the correct result as far as the direction of change was concerned, but it would have probably underestimated and considerably underestimated the rate of change by assuming that the values of the 43% of panel members who changed were already at those levels in 1971. The real-time evidence from 71 shows that both the panel members and the community as a whole were far less advanced in adopting dorsal R than what the 1984 data would allow us to infer. Because older speakers were participating in the change, it had started earlier and was proceeding much more rapidly than an apparent time inference would have led us to believe. Before leaving this case, I want to stress the fact of individual difference. Adopting an ongoing change in later life is evidently a path that individual speakers may take. Our colleague Raymond Moujon once called it jumping onto a moving train, and this very apt image keeps returning to me. But many other people on the train already when the train was standing still only started moving when the train itself began carrying them along. In the community shift towards a posterior R, although large numbers of individuals modified their phonology in later life, there were also many adults who maintained their earliest acquired patterns. You see there's a whole bunch of pink dots there on the bottom. So it would be wrong to say that this or any other trajectory type is a property of the change per se. It's a property of the speaker's lifespan. Now, the third trend. So, wait. Let me summarize that case. Change in the community is the result of individual speakers, especially younger speakers, being added to the pool of majority users or categorical users of the dorsal R. And transmission for most speakers in the first 2 decades of the change seemed to be from peers in later childhood or early adolescence. A generation later, young children started to acquire the dorsal R in first language acquisition from those very same people who had become their parents. Okay, the third trajectory is a retrograde lifespan change. This case that I'm going to present today is the replacement of the inflected future in affirmative clauses by the periphrastic future, which is an inflected form of aller, to go, plus the infinitive. It's perhaps the most surprising, and the lifespan trajectory that it exemplifies is probably the rarest of the three. The fact of change in this case is historically attested from at least the late 19th century and represents a trend that had clearly been going on for a long time before that. The inflected future is an inheritance from Latin, and the periphrastic form is first attested in the works of 15th century grammarians. It seems to have been gaining ground ever since. The definitive historical study by Poplack and Dion provides conclusive evidence that the alternation of inflected and periphrastic future found in our data represents the current stage of a long-term change in progress. They report for affirmative clauses in Québécois French that the inflected future dropped from 32% at the end of the 19th century to only 9% by the late 20th century. They considered the periphrastic future to have become the default in the affirmative and the inflected future to be the marked form in this environment. It's important to note that in negative clauses, the inflected form has remained obligatory for most speakers. So young children apparently learn this constraint in first language acquisition. An example of each form appears on the next slide from an interview with Germain T, that's a pseudonym. So first he says, mais un jour, je retournerai aux études. Ça, c'est sûr. I'm going to return to my studies. I'll go back to my studies for sure. And then later on, just a little bit later on, he says, oh, je ne sais pas, mais je vais retourner. Ça, c'est sûr. So we see je retournerai and je vais retourner is surely, sûr, in both cases. So he is showing the alternation. Now, as a very long attested late stage change, the trend comparison of the type made for the other cases yielded a result of stability across the 13-year interval between the two sample periods. This is probably too short to an interval to register a change in a very, very slow decline. Plotting individual speakers' use of the two variants showed that many of the youngest speakers in our 1971 sample, the 15 to 17-year-olds, did not use the inflected future at all in affirmative clauses. Looking at this result through the lens of apparent time, we thought it reasonable that the 9% rate had declined to 0 for these young speakers. There's our sample, by the way. So here they are. That's just showing you the sample. Now the result. This was the inflected future in 1971. All those blue dots along the bottom are people who did not use even once, and this is a variable that occurs with a decent amount of frequency, didn't use it. So we thought, okay, it was down to 9%. I guess the change is continuing, and those people are just representing the change in progress. Imagine our surprise when we discovered that the very same people, the panelists, in 1984, practically nobody is on that bottom line. Everybody, almost all the people who didn't use it at all, 13 years later when they had grown up to be in their 20s and 30s, we're making use of the inflected future, at least a little bit. So, okay, the mean rate of use was 10% in 1971 and 15.5%, a significant difference in 1984. So, excuse me, I have a page missing here. Here it is. Okay. Our study of the retrograde behavior of older speakers is far from the only one where this pattern has been attested. Wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. I'm a little bit lost in my slides here. Okay. I think I lost a page of my comments, so I'll just comment a little bit on this slide. The people who increased their use with aging were mainly upper class socioeconomic status speakers. They were categorized into 6 levels. So these are the people who are okay, this slide shows you an arrow for each speaker in terms of what that person was doing with inflected futures in 1971, and the end of the tip of the arrow is what they were doing in 1984. You can see that for the very most upper class speakers, almost everybody, there are 3 cases that went in the other direction out of, I think, 20. That what happened to them. But if you look at the people in the lower working class, you find that they're either stable or decreased with age. So a social class is a very important factor in this change. So this was, okay, now I'm back to my text. Our study of the retrograde behavior of older speakers is far from the only one where this pattern has been attested. So we find that, for example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg reverted to less frequent post-vocalic R in becoming a Supreme Court justice. David Attenborough reverted to R tapping as he got into his 70s and 80s. Ana Ziles shows that 2 of the 13 speakers she studied in Porto Alegre, Brazil, also went in the direction of becoming more old-fashioned in using nos instead of the more modern a gente. And there are a lot of other studies in the book, the collection published by Maria Eugênia Duarte, here present, and Maria de Paiva. Unfortunately, all my books on Brazilian linguistics are in my office at Penn, which I cannot reach. So I could not go back to that book and tell you a little bit more about the contents of it today. But after the COVID-19 is over, I will do so. Quite understandably, social processes are at work here because we see that social class, for example, makes a big difference. And Suzanne and I propose next month in our paper that just as children, in our paper that's going to appear in the Canadian Journal of Linguistics, that just as children look to slightly older peers as role models, when people reach mid to late adulthood, they're socialized into new groups at work, in community organizations, and as fellow grandparents. We refer in the paper to this process as senior peer pressure, which is part of acting one's age. The linguistic result of this situation may well be why late stage changes often have a very long tail. Such a process would link lifespan change to linguistic change writ large in a very intrinsic way. So, over the past 60 years, research studies by sociolinguists on ongoing language change number easily in the hundreds, maybe even the thousands. At the same time, historical linguists have continued to produce substantial analyses of historical change in languages. How do the two fit together? Why is it that putting these two levels together has rarely been attacked as a problem? To my knowledge, very few authors have addressed this relationship directly, and I'll be delighted if anyone in the audience has more work to bring to my attention. One of the reasons for this situation is that prior to the 20th century, historical linguists had to rely on written records, which themselves were often sparse or non-existent, and available data from the lifespans of individuals was even less available. Another is that an angle of vision combining the perspective of language change as an historical phenomenon with the changes involved in individual language learning, maturation, and aging faces the challenge of incommensurable time spans. Today, I'd like to cite 2 remarkable and important bodies of work that have gone some way to integrating the 2 perspectives. I think this slide is pretty much just what I finished saying, except that I want to underline the fact that retrograde trajectories in older speakers contribute to explaining why some changes have a very long tail. And we can say about these 3 trajectory types that if speakers are stable, they don't have any effect in changing anything. Apparent time reflects the relationships accurately, and transmission is probably children incrementing the change until they're about 18. If adults join the change, it speeds it up. The direction is right, but the rate is underestimated. And what happens is that adults jump onto the moving train. The third case of reversal or reversion, we can see that, as I just said, if adults adopt the conservative variant when they age, it slows the change down. So the rate here that would have been estimated by apparent time is an overestimation. And what happens is that children are observing the pattern in the broader community, and so are adults who accede to senior peer pressure, becoming more conservative. So lifespan change and language change, how do they fit together? The first study of the 2 that I want to talk about is the one by research by the late René Arnaud, who studied the rise of the progressive in English across an 80-year span that covered most of the 19th century. In earlier English, the simple present tense was used in many instances where speakers today use the progressive. Here are a few examples on this slide. Keats writes, these were personal letters. Keats writes, "Now I will return to Fanny. It rains." Today, people would pretty much say it's raining. Robert Browning writes, "My mother suffers still. I hope she's no worse." And his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, writes, "Oh, no time to write. The post goes," they say. Arnaud's data consisted of the copious personal correspondence of 12 male and 10 female authors with birth dates between 1767 and 1819, and writings dated between 1797 and 1879. Often written in haste, like we saw with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, personal correspondence represented the closest one might come to the spoken language of the time. The authors were the Romantics, whose letter writing was even more prolific than was their prose and poetry. Now, as the envelope of variation, which was when either a progressive or simple present might have been used, was virtually impossible to define, Arnaud used a density measure, the number of cases of the progressive per 1,000 words of text. Arnaud found that the later Romantics, born between 1795 and 1819, used progressives much more frequently than did the early Romantics, born a couple of decades earlier. As is typical of many linguistic changes, women led in the increasing use of the progressive. Here are the writers that he looked at. Though used most frequently by women writing to their closest intimates, both men's and women's usage was constrained stylistically according to 3 degrees of intimacy in letters to first of all, the family circle, bosom friends and lovers. The second degree, friends and relations in a more general sense, and 3, more distant connections. Lastly, Arnaud demonstrated that for writers whose correspondence spanned many decades, such as Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell, not a single one, he wrote, displays a falling curve in their increasing use of the progressive, with only 2. Here's Wordsworth, here's Gaskell, and here's Dickens. So, yeah, only 2 showed lifespan stability. All of the others showed an increase over their own lifespans. Providing mean usage rates for the authors by birth date enabled Arnaud to track the course of the change in the language. Tracing their writings year by year enabled him to look at authors' lifespan trajectories. Arnaud's methods did not enable him to give a firm chronological beginning and end point to this change. Nevertheless, the fact that the S-curve is relatively flat at both ends, and here's another set of people whose trajectories are less marked, but as you can see, they do not, in the end, decrease over their whole lifespans. And if you study those trajectories also, you find out that once people are about 40 or 50, they tend to flatten out. They also seem to increase during their teens, 20s, and 30s. Yes, his methods did not enable him to give a firm chronological beginning and end, but the fact that the S-curve is relatively flat at both ends allows us to infer that the change was active over about 80 years, from approximately 1800 to 1880. Another important body of research is based on the corpus of early English correspondence and at the University of Helsinki. And it has illuminated changes in English as far back as the 15th century. And here is a bunch of references. I will make this available later so people can look at these studies. These were studies by Tartu Nevalainen, Helena Ramolin, Brumberg, Arja Normi, and other of their colleagues at the University of Helsinki. The 6 morphological and syntactic changes they studied in late, middle, and early modern English spanned a period of about 270 years. These are the 6 changes that they studied. From 1410 to 1681. Among the 6 changes traced in the correspondence of people in Tudor and Stuart England, Nevalainen et al. 2011 report that all but 1 were completed during that period, that is, that 270-year period, and all follow an S-shaped curve. Sufficient data was found in letters. They again studied letters of these people, that between 73 and 129 writers provided evidence for each of the changes. You can see on the slide that they've given a picture of how long that particular change took, how they tell us how many writers attested examples that they used. And the next thing that they did was characterize the writers as progressive, conservative, or in-betweens for each of the changes. They have a very complicated statistical method for doing this, but roughly they called conservatives people whose usage fell significantly below the overall mean of all the writers. Progressives displayed rates significantly above it, and then they had the in-between ones. So the last column tells you how many people, what percentage of people were either progressive or conservative, and you can see that the rest of them were in-betweens. In some cases, most of the people were in-betweens, as in the ing variable there at the bottom. The time course also varied. Formerly only an object pronoun, you, replaced ye as a subject pronoun in about 80 years. At the other end of the scale, the change from mine to thine and my to thy went from incipient, below, which they call below 15% use, to completed, over 85% use in about 200 years. Nevalainen studied the replacement of subject ye by you during the mid phase of the change, between 1520 and 1559. Reporting only on the progressive and conservatives clarified community change at that period. She writes, the majority of those writing between 1520 and 1539 are conservative, while the majority of those writing 20 years later are progressive. Further, dividing the writers into 4 age groups by date of birth, she found that writers born after 1510, the youngest age cohort, have the most progressive members in both periods of writing. Fortunately, 4 people's writings provided enough data to establish their patterns at both periods, which gives an assessment of lifespan change. All 4 were stable according to this measure. 3 of them, who were born between 1485 and 1508, were conservative at both periods, whereas one, the inimitable Henry VIII, born in 1491, was progressive at the earlier period and remained progressive in the second period. It is interesting to note that his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, born in 1533, was the most progressive of all the writers reported on in the Bloomberg et al. Paper. And they have a long discussion of why that might have been the case, why she was a leader of change. Based on the correspondence of prolific writers long dead, the studies by Arnault and by the University of Helsinki group yielded different results in terms of the relationship between individuals' trajectories and ongoing language change. In their use of the progressive, only 2 speakers, a small minority, were stable across their history, and none reduced their density scores over time. In contrast, all 4 of the individuals Nevalainen traced were stable in their relationship to the change from ye to you. Sorry, I did not show you this, but we're running out of time, so I will skip right on to a very short discussion. So I hope we have some time for questions. In the previous section, I suggested that one reason we do not have a grip on how changes across the lifespan influence and are influenced by historical language change is the challenge of incommensurable time spans. A language change may take centuries to go to completion, as we just saw in some of this changes in Middle and Early Modern English. Individual lifespans, however, are more appropriately measured in decades. Similarly, the forces that influence language change include macrosocial events like wars, conquests, migrations that may not be experienced by individual people, and they may not be aware that competing variants in their own speech communities represent one phase in a historical arc that began long before they were born. For longitudinal research on the dynamics of language change, studies combining trend and panel surveys are the gold standard. They can confirm or refute a hypothesis of language change in progress over time. They can determine the rate of change in a speech community, and they can elucidate the multiple ways in which individual linguistic trajectories intersect with community language change. Integrating the time course relevant to the individual's lifespan with the broad sweep of changes that progress over a much longer period of time is an important project for contemporary historical sociolinguistics. I look forward to a future in which we will better understand how historical changes at every stage of the S-curve are interpreted and reinterpreted by members of the speech community over the generations and over individual lifespans. Thank you. So
Thank you, Gillian.
yes, I
Thank
can
you.
stop sharing my screen for the PowerPoint at this point. Okay.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. It was a brilliant talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have many questions, and it was useful to say good morning, good evening, and good afternoon and good evening, because we have people from all over the world. We have people from the United States, Argentina, Canada, Germany, India, and many other places in the world, many other countries. So we have a first question by Claudia Duarte. She doesn't say what is her institution, but she says that she wants to know how you moved from anthropology to sociolinguistics.
Oh, that's an easy question because it's biographical, and I should be able to answer it. I was always interested in language, but as I said in the beginning, you couldn't major in linguistics at that time. There was no linguistics department at McGill University. So by the time I got back to my PhD, I was in anthropology, and I had an advisor, Dr. Richard Salisbury, who was an economic anthropologist who also had done work in New Guinea. And I got ready to go to New Guinea, and I wrote a proposal about economic anthropology. And he said to me, your interest really is in language, right? Why don't you just write another proposal and about what you could do on multilingualism? And when you get there, do whatever you want. So,
and you went to Philadelphia, and
I got a job. Okay, very briefly, I got a job in the anthropology department at the University of Montreal, and I did my dissertation on multilingualism. And I was hired as an ethnolinguistic, but they let me do whatever I wanted, so that our study of Montreal started when I was in the anthropology department.
And you had a course, you took a course with Professor Labov.
No, I didn't take any courses.
Yes, you said before
I used his book as the topic of a seminar. Yeah.
Okay, a topic of a seminar.
We didn't invite him to come and talk to us in person.
Okay, thank you, Gillian. Livia Oshiro has a long question. It is in English, but she's mentioning especially the case of R, the rhotic. And her question is that your results also show change across lifespan for many individuals for the R variable.
Yes.
What is up? What is up with R? She asks. What is up? Is it the salience, Trudgill's comments, or could you have any possible idea about the possible role of this R on language change?
Okay, I think that there was always a high awareness of R in French Canada because there is a traditional dialect division in that Quebec City in the east had always the posterior uvular R, and Montreal and the western part of French Canada had the apical R. So people would move from one city to the next, and the kids would tease them about having the wrong R. This was already very salient to people. So in the 1960s, early 1960s, we had a social period in Quebec called La Révolution Tranquille, the Quiet Revolution, in which civil society became ascendant over the religious hierarchy that had ruled the place before. Maybe people will yell at me for saying it that way, but the Révolution Tranquille was a period of great social change, and there was more influence from France, where the uvular R was standard. And so I think it began at that time. But why R was already very salient to people because of the dialect difference. And some of the people in our corpus recounted to us stories of how they had moved as kids, whether they moved in the east or the west, whatever the other children would tease them for having the wrong one.
Okay, but you don't have cases of R deletion in the coda media, in the media position.
Sure. Okay, I was only talking about consonantal R. So for every speaker, yes, there's R deletion in certain environments, yes. And our paper on R goes into that in great detail. But I didn't want to talk about it here. So we, in calculating those percentages, of all the consonantal R's, which ones are apical and which are uvular was the way we proceeded.
Yes. So here we have something like beer, cerveja, beer.
Yes.
You have cerveja, coming from the northeast, reaching the southeast of the country. And maybe go into the middle of the country. Not yet. It doesn't have reached the south of the country. But it's always the R. The rhotics are really interesting, as we have Livia's question. We have a question from Argentina, and she asks us, sorry, if we were to start a project to study variation and change across the lifespan in Spanish, particularly following impact of inclusive morphology, what kind of corpus you suggest we gather?
Oh my goodness. I'm delighted to hear that, you know, young researchers are taking on the challenge of something that will turn out to be, a decades-long project if they're lucky, like we were. When we started our project, we didn't even think of it as the first slice of a longitudinal project. Thanks to Pierre Thibault and Diane Vincent, who had the brilliant idea of doing a restudy, we were able to do that. I wanted to say that for people who are interested in lifespan change, there are a lot of studies coming out now about people whose spoken records exist in the media, exist on the internet. People like David Attenborough, I mentioned Laura Mackenzie's study. He's been doing nature commentaries for 5 or 6 decades. People are looking at what happened with him over those decades. And other, in the 20th century, you can do that, the 21st century. So you don't have to have a big budget to, do a huge study. But if you have the resources, I would say how to construct a sample. I believe that it depends on the society in which you find yourself. And you have to think about what kind of a sample would represent that community. Was the question mostly about the sample, Eugenia? Or was it more about the whole methodology?
Yes, I believe we always start with interviews. Interviews would be, this is our best way. But today we have so many other means of studying to get spontaneous speech.
Right.
Podcasts, and students are using so many corpora to study spontaneous speech. Don't you think so?
Yes, that's great.
But we have to conduct the interviews if we are searching for something special.
Well, if you're searching for comparability, you have to find the same social situation. So that's why interviews have given you a way. It's possible, of course, that in interviews you get a more formal speech because people understand an interview as putting on their good clothes and speaking properly. But many techniques have been used to try to, and very successfully, to get people to speak a little bit more like they do in everyday life when they're in the interview.
Yeah, that's the problem, the paradox. This is the paradox. There is a question by Laura de Almeida. I think that's because she was not used to the recent focus on the lifespan of the individual. And she says, can you please explain again the relationship between lifespan change and linguistic change?
Well, okay. I'm saying that since the beginning of quantitative sociolinguistics with Labov in the 1960s, it's been possible for us to get a spotlight on long-term changes that are going on and see what is their distribution at one particular point in time.
Yeah.
So in order to, I mean, this is the most difficult question of all, to relate the two. Remember that when speaking about the R, I said the first generation of people in Montreal who adopted that uvular R, it seems to have been something with young people that they developed among peers. And then it started to spread, but not necessarily to all the older people. They're too old, they're stuck. They're stuck in their old-fashioned ways. So they represent the old system. How far back it goes, we don't really know. But that little window on the process gives us the idea, oh, the younger generation is coming along. They're doing something new. And so a change in the language could take up to 250 years, like we saw with the people studying Old English. So how did that happen in time? Like, did some people in the middle of the change? Okay, I think what I've seen in those studies that have tried to combine the two perspectives, that the people who change, like in Arnaud's work, the people who change are in their teens, 20s, 30s, maybe up to 40s. Pretty much beyond that, they don't change. And they represent what's possible in carrying that wave that's going to maybe be over 150 years or something like that. So the community of speakers is differentiated at any one point in time, but since change is going through it, we have to see, well, who's carrying it, who's leading, who's lagging. And so those, we don't really understand how all of that works, but I hope people will pay attention to it.
Okay, we definitely have to. I have now a question from a person whose name I cannot pronounce, but Gottug Kayat. Gottlieb Kayat. He asks, or she asks, I don't know.
You know in what country?
And it's maybe from India or another place, or Germany, I don't know. Have there been cross-linguistic research into variation around R, given it is a sound that reflects social and stylistic in many languages?
Yes, there has. And if that person would like to send me an email, my email address is gsankoff, GSANKOFF @comcast.net. I can provide some references, but in fact, there have been 3 conferences called erratics, R-attics, and there are 2 volumes already produced, perhaps already now 3, I'm not sure. I participated in a couple of them where people were discussing R in many, many different languages. So I can supply those references. In fact, I believe I might have a couple on my slides, which I assume that Abraline is going to make available on the web. So yeah, there's been a lot of work across languages.
Okay, and from Kayalp question, we go to Cristina Abreu Gomes, our colleague from the university, Cristina thanks you for your great talk, and she says, you presented evidence that lifespan change occurs with both phonetic, phonological variables and morphosyntactic as well. Do you think that the social values of the variants in the context of the individual's social background is relevant to lead to one direction or to the other? So the social values of the variant can guide the change from one direction or to the other.
Meaning that the change will progress or perhaps be erased. I mean, I think that, for example, in French Canada, in Quebec, and in many countries in the world, people are spending more years in school than they used to. So we had older people in our sample who went to school for 3 years or 5 years and didn't really learn how to read very well. And now everyone finishes high school almost. So though all those years of schooling contribute, I think, to the standard language having more pressure on certain variables. For example, the fact that the traditional use of avoir to have as in conjugating those verbs of motion and change of state, that seems to be disappearing as a result of increased education in the population. It's pushing in one direction. So I think, again, we have to understand the social forces, which can be different at different times and places. Things like dialect, contact, and prestige also. In the work of the Helsinki corpus, they talk a lot about the role of London versus Northern dialects and Eastern dialects in having the prestige, where the forms originating from those places are the ones that spread. So it's the understanding of the social history that's going to help you figure it out.
And by the way, when we recover some old structures, lost, almost extinct structures through schooling, we usually don't take them, carry them to our speech. We restrain the use and we recover them in very small percentages in our writing. We are taking structures from the speech to writing. This is interesting, except for agreement. Agreement is our big point here. But I have to say that our friend Kayalp is from Turkey. Okay. And I have this information. And now we have a question from James Walker. He asks, what happened to the data that Beatriz Lavandera collected in the 1970s? Because of Argentinian. Beatriz Lavandera collected data in the 1970s. And he asks, what happened to the data she collected? Do you have an idea?
I don't, but I thank James, who I am assuming is in Australia at the moment, as a fellow expatriate Canadian. I don't know. I do not think it's in the sociolinguistics lab at Penn, although as Bill mentioned last week, the University of Pennsylvania library has digitized all of our records, and I do not think Beatriz's data was there. But perhaps someone from Argentina knows about that.
Okay.
I could, again, correspond with James or anyone else to help figure out maybe some possibilities. I don't know.
Okay, well, we should know, because we have to start studying sociolinguistics to increase the studies in sociolinguistics in America, in Spanish-speaking America.
Okay.
Brazil is in the leadership, and also in Europe as well, in Spain and Italian and other countries. But now we have a question from Martina Gertz, from a student from Hamburg, Germany. And she thanks you so much for your talk and says,
thank you, Martina.
If we look at the French ne, which is less used than before, we should wait 100 years until we see the end of the change.
Martina, I have a lot to say about ne. I almost put it in the paper, but in another recent publication, I talk about it, because I've looked at the corpora from child acquisition to see if ne is present, and I find that adults who use ne almost not at all in their own speech use it. So you'll get somebody who uses ne like at 2% or 0% or 5% as an adult, and they're talking to their kid, they use it about 20%. So they're putting that input into the child at a level where it's much increased over what they use to each other. And so the child gets to know about ne, but they themselves don't use it until they get a lot older. So this is part of the puzzle of how acquisition rates relates to variation and change, because somehow age grading comes in, like for the older speakers. So this is why one of my questions has always been, why do these things not disappear? Why did ne not disappear completely? Lo and behold, when people get older, they use more ne also. We have some of our speakers from 3 periods. I said we have 12 precious speakers. One was a law student who then became a lawyer, who then became a judge. When he is a judge, ne is cropping up in his speech in his 50s. You don't hear it before that. And as a student, he had no cases, and he was a big talker. So these things are there somehow, but people either don't feel entitled, they don't have the social position to use them. So those things are very interesting. And if Martina is interested in we do have a few papers on that, which we'll be happy to share.
Yeah, but it's interesting because from what you showed us today, the possibility of stability, the possibility of following the innovations and changing across the new generations, following the community, and the possibility of reversal. So this is really very interesting, and we have been familiar with most of the cases you told us today because the texts you mentioned. But the surprise for me was the avoir as an auxiliary in the as a selected auxiliary with an accusative verbs, particularly venir.
Yeah.
But I remember reading that the preferred subjects were non-animate, but it's not true. I was mistaken, maybe. The preferred subjects have the feature animate.
Yeah.
Je venu.
Right. And as a matter of fact, the paper that I published in Language last year has more cases of that. But the verb avoir with venir is concentrated in certain fixed expressions, and often when it means to become instead of come. So when a woman says "j'ai venu rouge," I got like I was blushing, I became red.
Fico vermelho.
And venir au monde to mean I was born. So the examples that I showed you today was j'ai venu au monde at such and such a place. I came into such a place. So those expressions, we see them crop, and that's a very old-fashioned expression too. Young people don't talk about coming into the world when they were born. So,
but okay, I don't know if I'm. No, sorry, I interrupted you. Sorry.
Go on.
And I noticed that most of the change in the lifespan, across lifespan, towards old, more conservative features, depend a lot on schooling, education. So improving the degree of education should be a factor to make old, almost lost structures return. It was a surprise, the simple past, the inflected future, the inflected future. I was really surprised with this, but it returns with older speaker and more educated speaker.
Right.
So maybe it should be unexplained. And from what you said, I am each time more enthusiastic with the short-term real-time studies. The studies of the community and the individual, and the panel and trend studies, because from these studies we will find the answers for everything you told us today.
Thank you.
So this has been really an excellent talk, and we have to thank Gillian. Gillian, thank you so much, and thank you for remembering. I know you always remember Fernando Tarallo, but we had the same thinking, I think, of telling the younger students that we are indebted to you, and this made us friends forever and thankful to you. And of course, sociolinguistics had already arrived here, and we owe too much to Naro, who became Anthony Naro
Absolutely. And, I had I wanted to put in some some information about the studies of Toninaro and Marta Scherre, who have been so influential. But again, my books on Portuguese are imprisoned in my office, which I cannot reach. So I had a slide from them, which had been, which went bad, and I couldn't reconstruct it to put in some information about that study. But we're very grateful to them for their work. Yeah.
I believe Marta has been the most enthusiastic person in the world with social linguistics, and she's already now watching us, and she's paying attention.
Hi, Marta.
Since morning, she says hello, and I'm surprised that she didn't ask a question today. So
sure, we'll be corresponding. We've been corresponding, and we'll continue to correspond.
Of course. So I wish you a wonderful day. I thank you.
Thank you
for the Brazilian Association of Linguistics. I believe you gave us an excellent opportunity to pass some happy hours in the middle of all this tragedy in the world. So thank you also for giving us such wonderful moments with you. The same we had last week with Professor Labov, and we'll have with many other sociolinguistics and other linguistics from everywhere. So have a very good day.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Abralyn. Thank you, Miguel.